Hello all, I'm Sai and you're watching the Book Dragon. In today's video, I'm bringing to you my 2022 Book Bingo wrap-up. If you didn't know, I made this reading challenge kind of thing with a bingo card that has 25 prompts to read different books from. It's not like you have to read 25 different books in order to complete the challenge. You can just read 5 books alone according to the prompts and even complete the bingo. Some of you guys participated in the challenge with me and I also completed the challenge way back in July itself, but I wanted to wait until the end of the year so that everyone else has finished the challenge also. Few of you guys did finish the challenge and you sent me the bingo cards which I posted on my Instagram stories. I have talked about most of all these books repeatedly in the channel over the years, so I don't want to repeat myself in multiple videos. Because of that, I'm going to keep my description of each and every one of the books as short as I can. So without any more further ado, let's get into the books right away. The first prompt was to read a thriller book, and for this one I chose an Indian psychological thriller book because it was also a paid review that I did in 2022. The book is The Illusionists by Aashish Gupta. The psychological thriller element of this book was the best part according to me. The writing was not that great, but as a whole the book was a really quick and fast paced read. The basic plot of the book is that there are two brothers in this imaginary city and they are participating in this election. Only one of the two can win, and in order to decide who is going to win they have to argue with each other, and the one who ends up losing the argument should shoot himself to death. I have a review for this one already out in the channel, and if I have reviews for any of the other books, all of them will be linked down in the description, so do check them out if you are interested. The second prompt is to read a Stephen King book, and for this one I read actually 3 Stephen King books, of which one is a short story collection, but the book which I am considering for this prompt is Insomnia. That is the biggest Stephen King book which I read in 2022, and I should say it was really well written. The only problem with that book is that there is so much of build up and it is just super slow paced. If not for that, I think the book is a really great work. The third prompt is to read a book with an adaptation, and for this one I went with Call Me By Your Name by Aciman. I've actually watched the movie a couple of years before and the movie was really good, so I just wanted to give the book a read. I should say that the book was also as good as the movie, but I think the movie did a better way of portraying both the characters properly for us compared to the book. And there are some things which are changed in the movie also which were not shown in the book. So this is the book which has an adaptation. The fourth prompt is to read a book that was published in 2022, and for this one I went with Gallant. It was definitely a very disappointing read for me and I don't want to elaborate on that. The fifth prompt was to read a historical fiction book, and for this one I went with a very sad book, and it is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by Boyne. I should say this was a good book, but it did not have that much of an emotional impact on me as I thought it would, and it also ended up being in my disappointing reads of 2022 list. I think I had only 5 books in there, and of those Gallant and The Boy in the Striped Pajamas were there, which is not that great if you ask me. Still, it was a good book and I have not watched the movie yet. The next prompt is to read a novella, and for this one I went with a Heartstopper novella, which is Nick and Charlie by Alice Oseman. I had just finished reading the Heartstopper series and Radio Silence way back in January 2022, and after that I just wanted to know more about this author's writing, so I went forward and read this novella as an audiobook. If you have not tried Heartstopper yet, just go forward and try it. I'm sure you'll not be disappointed. The next one is to read a book with an animal companion, and for this one I went with Eldest by Christopher Paolini, which is the second book inside the Inheritance Cycle Quartet. The entire series was slow, but it was very well written, and it is super inspired by the Lord of the Rings. If you read both the series, you can understand what I'm trying to say. But as a whole, I like this series very much, but I'm sure that I'll not be going back and reading the series at any point at all. More than anything, the dragon lore inside the series was really good, and I have two other prompts inside this video itself, so let's just see them further on in the video. The next one is to read a book that is written in verse, and for this one I went with Punching the Air by E.B. Zoboi and Yusef Salaam. I wanted to read this book for over 2 years now, and finally I got my hands on it in 2022 only, and I should say it is a really fast as well as effective read. You will not be able to contain your emotions while you are reading certain lines from the book because they are just written in such a powerful way. They are very simple illustrations, at the same time they are super effective also, so if you have not tried this, just go forward and try it. I personally think this is one book everyone needs to read. Next we have a series, and for this one I am going with Heartstopper because that's the series which I read way back in January, and I think I crossed off this prompt way back in January itself. Again, I have talked about Heartstopper countless times in the channel already. I don't want to reiterate myself. Next is to read a book by an LGBTQ author, and for this one I'm going with The Deep by Rivers Solomon. The author is a non-binary person, and the way in which they have written the book is really nice. It is again standalone fantasy novella. It is a story that happens under the water, and it is kind of regarding mer people, but the way in which the author has shown their culture and the way in which they lead their lives there is really nice. Again, it is kind of a different world and difficult world to visualize because it happens almost underwater, and the things that these people are doing is not always very easily understandable for us, but as a whole in an emotional way this was a really good book. The next one is to read a book with a dragon in it, and for this one I'm going with Eragon by Christopher Paolini again, which is the first book inside the Inheritance Cycle Quartet. I should say I have read Eragon once before long time back, and I reread it back in 2022, and I should say I think I enjoyed it a bit more in 2022 compared to the first time that I read it. And I also finished Eragon and moved on to the second book, Eldest, as soon as I finished it, and that's the only reason I was able to finish the series, because it is super slow paced, and if you take huge breaks in between the books, I'm sure you'll not be able to finish the series because it is not that motivating. because it is very slow paced. But I'm glad that I read it because the dragon-human connection in this one was really well done. Then we have a biography, autobiography, or a memoir, and for this one I went with When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. It is again yet another wonderful book, and I think it also ended up being one of my favorites of 2022. I don't remember properly, so I'll try to link that video also down in the description. The next prompt was to read a classic, and I was sure that I will not be able to finish this prompt when I started the year because I was not at all into reading classics at all, and even now I'm not very a classic genre loving kind of person because I don't feel like it meshes with me in any way at all. And despite all those things, I just went forward and read a children's classic, which is The Wizard of Oz, and I read this one also because we had this book called Wicked which we read for a book club, and I ended up DNFing that book also because I did not like that. Just in order to understand the villain backstory for Wicked, I went forward and read this one, but I liked this and did not like Wicked. I know that is kind of a stretch, still I did like it and I did read a classic. Next is to read a book with a mental health representation, and for this one I go with Will Grayson by John Green and David Levithan. One of the two main characters whom we see here, that is one Will Grayson, is suffering from depression from the beginning of the book until the end. Even with that, he manages to do all of the things that he is going through in his life, and you can easily say that he is depressed from just the way he speaks and the way in which his dialogues are written. And I'll also say that the depression that is shown from the main character here is not in a hopeless way, but just in a normal way that we all see in our realistic lives. That's why I wanted to count this book for the prompt compared to some of the other books which I read in the year. Next prompt is to read a book with an Indian main character, and for this one I went with Valmiki's Women by Anand Neelakantan, which is a historical retelling of some of the parts of the Ramayana that is done by the author. Again, I have talked about this book so many times in the channel. If you have not read it, go forward and try it. I'm sure you'll not be disappointed at all, especially if you know the story of Ramayana already. You'll be able to see the story from a completely different facet, and you'll be able to understand the point of view of some of the negative villainous characters that we are contemporarily shown in the Ramayana. After I finish reading this one, I definitely want to read so many other books by the author. I've not read any yet, but I think I'll be doing them pretty soon. Then we have a book with an LGBTQ main character. For this, I went with My Brother's Name is Jessica by John Boyne. I read only 2 John Boyne books last year, and both of them ended up being in this list. I can say I liked this one more compared to The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is even more popular by the author. The reason why I like this more is because the representation of the trans main character in this one was done really well by the author, and it is also again another hopeful story instead of a very traumatic or sad one. I'm sure that all those stories also deserve just as much importance as the happy stories, but I think this was even more hopeful in tone, even though it contained all the difficulties that are faced by the main character. So I just want to give a shout out for this book. The next prompt is to read a book that was published in the last 5 years. For this one, I went with The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty because I wanted to finish the Devabad trilogy in 2022. I did not end up finishing it, but as a whole, I enjoyed the book during my reread compared to the first time I read it because I was able to see a lot more hidden things that the author did in the writing and description of the book that I was not able to see during my first read. Once I reread the book, I was able to understand how much I enjoyed this world and the magic that the author has written for the characters. It is a series that deals with a lot of politics and different factions of people who can perform different kinds of magic. Next is to read a book that is set in your country, and for this one I went with I Too Had a Love Story by Ravinder Singh. It was a very touching and sad story. The writing in this book alone was not as much to the mark because it is the first book by the author, and it is more like a autobiographical section of the author's life compared to a story because it is a real life love story. The next prompt is to just read a non-fiction book, and for this one I did read a lot of non-fiction books, but I wanted to include this one in specific because it felt like it was very beginner friendly, and it also is a combination of so many other different types inside the non-fiction category. So the book is The Almanac of Naval Ravikant by Eric Jorgensen. If I'm not wrong, you can just listen to the audiobook of this one for free in the website of the book itself because it is just a collection of tweets, interviews, speeches and various other things that are related to this person named Naval Ravikant. So if you're a beginner when it comes to self-help books, just give this a try. I'm sure that it will be a mixture of all different kinds inside the non-fiction category itself. The next prompt is to read a book with a main character who's also a person of color. For this one, I go with Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. Again, I have talked about Radio Silence so many times in the channel already because it is one of my top 2 favorite books from 2022, and I again read it way back in Jan 2022. This is the book which I've related to the most in my life compared to all the other books that I've read so far. The next prompt is to read a book by your favorite author, and for this I went with Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. I reread King of Scars and I read this one for the first time in 2022. The way in which she wrapped up certain things in Rule of Wolves was good, but other things just felt like she did it without any purpose just because the fans would enjoy it. I as a fan did enjoy all those specific moments, but I don't think all of those were necessary for the progression of the story or the series as a whole itself. I just want her to put a pause on the Grishaverse and go and do something with Ketterdam and the Crows, or something that is completely unrelated to the Grishaverse, because I think things are getting a bit stagnant over there. The next prompt is to read a standalone fantasy book, and for this one I went with the next prompt is to read a standalone fantasy book, for which I read An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. The author has written multiple standalone fantasy books if I'm not wrong, and I read this one only last. The next prompt is to read a book with a bookish title, for which I read The Book of Essie by Megan McLean Weir. This is one book which surprised me a lot last year because I did not expect it to be that good. It is a literary fiction about this family whose life is televised to the world, and because of that they make a lot of money. Our main character Esther here is a 16-year-old girl and she is pregnant. It has a very satisfying climax, so if you are interested, just give it a read. The next prompt is to read a tome, that is a book with over 500 pages. For this prompt, I go with another book from the Inheritance Cycle Quartet, which is the last and final book, Inheritance. The last and final prompt is to read a short story collection, and for this one, I read The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. My plan was to finish reading the entirety of the Sherlock Holmes series in 2022 itself, but I did not succeed in doing it because I don't know, I was not that much of in a mood to read Sherlock Holmes in the second half of the year. If not, I would have completed the series. But The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes was good, but it was not as good as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So if you're interested in the series, you can definitely give it a try. So yes guys, those are all the 25 books which I read for my 2022 Book Bingo challenge. And if you did enjoy watching today's video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and also share it to your friends. If you want to get more content from me, do subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day.